Greetings, it is I, Tentus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! It's time to continue our History of Magic Gathering expose. Today, I have the next one for you, Odyssey. Now, Odyssey was released on October 1st of 2001. It was the 24th set released by Magic, expansion released by Magic. Had 350 cards, and it was the first set in the Odyssey block. Now, it had the themes of filter lands, graveyard matters, token creatures, and unusual tribes, and had the keywords of both threshold and flashback. Its symbol was what made to represent the Mirari, an artifact that I'll talk about a little later in this one. Now, this set and all the sets in the block had a great theme of graveyard matters. That means it revolved around of materials either taking, putting things, counting the numbers, all around the graveyard. Again, most of these graveyard matters cards tended to be green and black, but all colors did have them. This was the first set to really bring this theme to life. Now, it was sold in 75 card tournament packs, 15 card boosters, 4 pre-constructed decks, and a fat pack. The pre-release was on September 22nd to 23rd, and the pre-release card was Stone Tongue Basilisk in Arabic. It had a novel of the same name based on it. Now, its storyline takes us to Otoneria in Dominaria, a new continent we haven't visited before, about 100 years after the effects of the apocalypse and the invasion block. Phyrexian invasion, already done. We focus on a number of civilizations on this continent scraping by, but there's one group amongst them that seems to have the greatest control, the Cabal. They're manipulating the others and using these pit fights that people are very happy with and brings a lot of joy to their miserable lives in order to bring them in. The story focuses on Kamal, a young barbarian from these Pardic Mountains, a section of the area, who decides to go to the pits and fight in order to give himself a name, to make a name for himself. He doesn't like where he's in life. Along the way, he meets a lot of friends, loses some friends, and the events that revolve around him, what kind of events he gets into, affect and shape the continent. All of them revolve around this powerful artifact called the Mirari, which when someone gazes upon it, they become infatuated with it, that it almost seems to promise them great amounts of power. Now, this set did suffer from some hatred from amongst the fans. They didn't like the fact that there was this forced shift to graveyard focus. People didn't like that naturally. But once it's been reflected upon historically, many agree that this set was very important because it brought these graveyard matters to the forefront and allowed for a lot of the important cards that we see in the future to actually come about. It was a step in the evolution, especially when it comes to graveyard-related matters. Now, it's important to note there is a mistake we want to mention that technically didn't occur on all the cards. We'll talk about other mistakes later on. But in Cephalid Looter, a number of them actually had an extra subtype. They all were cephalids, but a number of them also said they were wizards. Not all of them, which is very interesting. The fact is, since then it has been eroded, and it is a cephalid rogue. Now, it had 6 tokens you could get as part of the Magic Player's rewards, including a squirrel token. It introduced 2 major keywords, the first being flashback. Flashback would allow someone to pay a mana cost when the flashback card is in their graveyard in order to cast this instant or sorcery a second time. Afterwards, it would get exiled. So effectively, I could cast a spell twice, once from my hand, once from my graveyard. Originally, it had a little symbol in the upper left corner, this little tombstone symbol for these early cards that allowed you to find them easier. When flashback has returned since then, this graveyard symbol has been removed. Now, the other keyword was threshold. Threshold was a static effect that when the player who has the card with threshold in it has 7 or more cards in their graveyard, threshold activated, which gave an extra effect. Maybe it gave an extra ability to a creature, extra effect to enchantment, extra effect to a spell. But effectively, it's static that when 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, threshold activates. It also expanded protection. Up until now, protection had been from certain colors. This introduced protection from all colors and protection from certain types of cards. Protection from creatures, enchantments, lands, things like that. It did have a minor theme of tokens. It had more token generation than many of the other sets, and it had a number of cards which dealt on discarding cards or sacrificing permanents, which oftentimes, especially for the sacrificing permanents, token generation usually was best when revolving around that. Now, it had 15 cycles in it, including 4 cycles which were based on allied colors, and of course, 11 cycles based around the basic color wheel. Let's talk about this 11 cycles. First off was bursts. Each of the bursts, when you would play it, would have a basic effect, and then it would have an increased effect based upon the number of cards with similar names in your graveyard. So if I would play a burst spell, if I had 2 other of the same name burst spells in my graveyard, my burst would have a greater effect. There were some cards which counted as certain types of bursts that when they're in graveyard, you would add them together with that. The desires were enchantment auras that had a basic effect and had a threshold effect that you could have on it. So it had 2 abilities, one that would just get threshold ability, and each of them was named after a legend that pertained to the storyline in this block. The hounds were 2/2 creatures that were each 1 mana, 1 colorless mana, and 1 mana that basically had a ability or activated ability based around the colors they were. The land auras were a group of 5, but there were 4 of them that had beneficial effects when you activated them, and a negative effect that was a triggered ability that you could put on a land. The Lyrgirfs, I'm probably butchering the way you pronounce that, were star creatures that each of them had a unique way of figuring out what star was, but the same creature type. The Retrievers were 2/2 creatures that when you put them into play, you would return a card of a certain type from your graveyard to your hand. 4 of these were reprints, with another one of them replacing an older version of it. The Rights were spells that had effects that were numerical based on the number of cards that you would discard at the resolution of the spell. So I'd play a Right, I'd discard a number of cards, and that would tell me what kind of ability that Right would have. Shrines were cards that had an activated ability that triggered when you played a spell. It would be based upon the number of spells in your graveyard with the same name as the one you're playing. So similar to the burst spells, the shrines would check how many of whatever type of spell you have in your graveyard and have a numerical effect of it. So the more copies of a spell you played, the better effect the shrine would have. In a cycle of spheres, these white enchantments reduce the damage from a source of a color by 2 to you. So from a spell or ability of, let's say, red, if you had the red sphere out, it would be reduced by 2 when dealing with you. There was a cycle of all the different colors in the spheres. There was a cycle of sacklands. They would come into play tap. You could tap them from a color that matches them in the cycle, but each of them you could also tap and sacrifice for a mana of any color. So you could have a sackland that you'd be tapping for white, or you could sacrifice it for any color you needed. It had a cycle of threshold lands. Of course, you could tap it for a color that matches part of the cycle, but you could also have a threshold ability that when threshold was met, each of them had their own abilities. Now let's talk about the 4 cycles which were based on allied colors. First off is the cycle of Atogs. These were, of course, based on the old Atog creature. Each of them had 2 activated abilities that you would basically feed them something, sacrifice something to them, and they would get +1/+1 until end of turn. So they could be pumped up each appropriately by some kind of sacrificial effect. It had a cycle of rare gold spells. It had a cycle of eggs, which you could tap 2 mana, tap it, sacrifice it, get a pair of allied mana, and then draw a card. It had a cycle of filtered lands, where you could tap 1 mana, tap it, to get a pair of allied colored mana. Now it also did have 3 vertical cycles. First off, it had a cycle of green token producing spells, that each one of them would produce tokens and had a flashback cost to reproduce those tokens again. It had a cycle of punishing spells. These red spells would have 2 effects. More than often, one of them would be damaging a player. And it had a vertical cycle of thought beasts. These flying blue creatures, each of them got bigger, but each of them also reduced your maximum hand size while they were out in play. Now it had 2 matched pairs. It had a pair of pilgrims. Each of these had protection from one of the enemy colors of white and a 1 white mana sacrifice ability on them. There was also a pair of Avens with the Aven Smoke Weaver and Treetop Sentinel. Each of these 2/3 board soldiers with flying had a protection from an enemy color of blue. There was a number of reprints, including Overrun. 10 functional reprints, including Leaf Dancer for Cat Warriors. And it introduced you to Wild Mongrel, which was same mana cost as Grizzly Bears, just better. So it was replacing Grizzly Bears and a number of other, basically, reprints of that card, which had already come out in play. The other major mistake in the printing, this one on all the cards was bashed to bits, had the wrong artist down in the bottom. Now, the theme decks that were released were, of course, a white-blue called Liftoff, a red-green called 1/2 punch, a black-red called Pressure Cooker, and a blue-green called Trounce-O-Matic. So let's talk about cards from the set. First is Extomb. This one, you search your library for a creature card, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle your library. For decks that could easily bring back creatures from graveyards, searching for one and throwing it in the graveyard right away, very good combos. Nimble Mongoose, a 1/1 Shroud that has a threshold of +2/+2. Pretty decent. Psychotog. You could either discard a card to give it +1/+1, or you could exile 2 cards from your graveyard to give it +1/+1. This one, at the time, was considered broken. It had a lot of combos based around this set that you could pump it up very quickly, very good, based around a lot of them. Big tournament decks were Psychotog decks. A lot of the champions and winners used Psychotog, meaning it's just the power level that could be built along with the deck meant that a lot of people thought it was broken at the time. Since then, of course, it hasn't had as much effect, but it still has this memory of being a very powerful card at the time for only being an uncommon. Shadow Mage Infiltrator, a fear creature that when it dealt combat damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Stand Still. Whenever a player plays a spell, you sacrifice Stand Still, and all of that player's opponents draw 3 cards, meaning effectively no one wants to play a spell when you play Stand Still. Absalom, Cephalid Emperor. You could tap an untapped Cephalid you control in order to tap a permanent, or you could pay 3 blue and tap him in order to tap all creatures without flying. The Atog, the Rainbow Atog. It was a 5/5 that you could sacrifice an Atog to give it +X/+X until end of turn, where X was that creature's power. Bearscape, a colorless and a green. Exile 2 cards from your graveyard to put a 2/2 bear token into play. Bomb Squad. You tap it to put a fuse counter on target creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put another fuse counter on a creature that has a fuse counter. If a creature ever has 4 or more fuse counters on it, you remove all those counters, destroy said creature, and its controller takes 4 damage. Braids, Cobalt Minion, a legendary. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they sacrifice a land, creature, or artifact. Burning Sands. When a creature card is put into the graveyard from play, its controller sacrifices a land. Cabal Patriarch. For 2 colors and a black, sacrifice a creature. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. For 2 colors and a black, exile a creature card from your graveyard. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Catalyst Stone. Your flashback costs 2 less. Your opponent's flashback costs 2 more. Cultural Exchange. Choose any number of target creatures target player controls, then choose another target player, choose the same number of creatures they control. Those 2 players exchange control of those creatures. You effectively go you and you, exchange a bunch of creatures. Or you and me, exchange a bunch of creatures. Have a bunch of tokens. Decimate. Destroy target artifact, creature, enchantment, and land. Get rid of 4 things with 1 spell. Diabolic Tutor. You search your library for a card, put it in your hand, shuffle your library afterwards. It's been a classic since then for deck searching, replacing Demonic Tutor that's long been banned. Extract. You search target opponent's library for a card, remove it from the game. They shuffle their library afterwards. You just pluck something out of their library that you didn't want to deal with. Gravestorm. At the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent may remove a card from their graveyard from the game. If they don't, you may draw a card. Haunting Echoes. You exile all cards in target player's graveyard, except for basic lands, from the game. Then you search your library for every card that has a name the same as one of those ones you just exiled, and also exiled them. So you just pick out everything that's in their graveyard, any copies of them from their deck, get rid of them all. Iridescent Angel, a 4/4 flyer with protection from all colors. Cabal Pitfighter, 6/1 haste that can tap to do 3 damage to target creature or player. Martyr Apothecary, you can tap an untapped cleric you control. The next 2 damage that will be dealt to target creature or player. Mine Layer, 1 in a red, you tap it, you put a mine counter on target land. When target land becomes tapped, it is destroyed. If Mine Layer should leave the battlefield, remove all mine counters from the game. Mirari, whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, you may pay 3 and copy that. Mirari is a good legendary artifact. You can copy spells with 3 mana, and any color, because it's an artifact. Nut Collector, beginning of upkeep, you put a 1/1 scroll into play. Threshold, squirrels get +2/+2. Squirrel-based decks were based around Nut Collector. Recoup. Target sorcery in your graveyard gets flashback equal to its mana cost. It itself has flashback for 3 in a red. Time Stretch. Target player takes 2 extra turns. Better than Time Warp, but a lot more expensive. Traumatize. Target player puts the top half of their library, rounded down, into their graveyard. The blue-black combo was Traumatize, Haunting Echoes. They wouldn't have much of a deck left afterwards. Upheaval. Return all permanents to their owner's hands. You basically wipe the board back to everybody's hands, restart the game. Werebear. I love the code on this one. It taps for a green mana, just like a Landwar Elf, but has a threshold of getting +3/+3. It has the right to bear arms. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Magic. Thank you. And of course, Whipkeeper. You tap it to deal damage to target creature equal to the damage it has already taken this turn. So if you have a burn deck or something that creatures are going to be taking damage, you can use Whipkeeper, double the damage on it, kill off things you wouldn't normally be able to kill. So that's it for today. I introduced you to Odyssey. Now, Odyssey itself was not as popular as you'd think because it forced a mechanic on people, that it drawed in a way of thinking. And a lot of its cards are actually not that powerful and memorable. Very few have retained deck status that a lot of people that play Legacy use even to today. Some still are good, but the fact is, it is important because it introduced a lot of graveyard mechanics and brought the graveyard as using it as part of a mechanic to the front. It evolved uses of graveyards to what it is more today. And the fact is you can find cards which pertain to the graveyard much more likely than you used to. Before then, graveyard was only sort of important. You looked at occasionally. Now, it's a mechanic, part of your game that you can look on very often. But regardless, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think about, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, link description below. If you want to check out some other great Magic stuff, I can recommend to you Card Bazaar, They Said, We Said, and Tasty Snackies, my friends in the multiverse. Great people, do some great Magic content, and more. Please check them out. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.